pretty dramatic ways, as this happens for a lot of teenagers around that age. And as her body was changing in ways that were strange to her, new to her, she started beginning to get a lot more attention, unwanted attention from the boys in her class, from other men in her life. She started experiencing anxiety, distress, even depression. She didn't really know how to process all of these thoughts. And as she continued to age, by the time she hit her 16th birthday, she was so at odds with the body that she had that she came out to her mother as being transgender. And so her mom, wanting to be very supportive of Kelsey, took her to see her family doctor, who referred Kelsey to an endocrinologist, which is a specialist in hormones. After just 2 15-minute consultations, this endocrinologist prescribed for her the opposite sex hormone, which for a girl would be the opposite sex would be testosterone. And so Kelsey was expected to inject synthetic testosterone into her body once a week, every week, for the rest of her life. Within a few months, Kelsey was being wheeled down a hospital hall to a surgery room to have both of her breasts surgically removed. Now her mother, Mary was her name, her mother wanted to be very supportive of her child. She wanted to be supportive and encourage her distressed, anxious girl. And so she affirmed every decision along the way, supported Kelsey in her transition to male, and applauded her and encouraged her, as did Kelsey's teachers, her doctors, her classmates, and friends. Now, those hormone injections were supposed to address the anxiety and the depression and the suicidal thoughts. The surgery was supposed to do the same. But it didn't. In fact, Kelsey's anxiety, her depression, her suicidal ideation increased after the surgery. It got worse instead of better. Today, Kelsey is 21 years old, and she recently confessed to her mom that when she was being wheeled down that hospital hall to the surgery room, she was having very serious doubts. Do I really want to go through this with this? Is this really what I want? But she had nobody to confess her doubts to. She had nobody to talk to. Everyone around her, the doctors, the teachers, her mom, her friends, they were all saying this was what was best for her. This is really what she needed. Kelsey has been robbed. The doctors have taken her breasts. They've mutilated her body with synthetic hormones. Even if one day she could carry a child, she will never know what it's like to breastfeed her own baby. So how did we get to this point in Canada today? How did we get to this point where a young girl can be so terribly mutilated and there is no one there to affirm Kelsey's doubts? Well, I want to explore that question with you today. But really, the underlying answer to that question, how did we get here, comes down to a question of religion. And that is that our current culture has embraced this idea of mind-body dualism. And you heard a little bit about that last night from Reverend Mordyke. That the body is just this cage that we inhabit, but the true you is your soul or your mind, and that's your true you. And it can be whatever you want it to be, and we can manipulate the body through surgery or through injections of hormones and chemicals and so on. We can manipulate that body to look however we want it to look. And this is coming out of an ancient religious idea known as Gnosticism, which embraced this separation of mind and body, or soul and body. And it's wrong. It's a heresy that the church actually stamped out about 1,800 years ago. But it's back. So I want to explore with you what our alternative to that is and how it came back. How did this idea come back? The alternative, of course, is the Christian view, which is that we are body-soul composites, or even better, I liked what Reverend Mordyke said last night, we are enfleshed souls. We are enfleshed souls. That's the Christian view. That's a creational view. That's what God reveals about us in His Word, and also as we look around ourselves today, as you come to understand what does it mean to be a human. We are enfleshed souls. And against that Christian position is the rise of a new cultural teaching that says rather that we're different than that? How does Kelsey get to be at a place where she's sitting in a wheelchair being wheeled down a hospital hall, and the civil government is paying for the surgery, and her doctors, her teachers, her mother, and her friends are all saying, this is what we should do to you, 16-year-old Kelsey. How do we get there? It's because the culture has embraced this Gnosticism. It's the dominant religious view of the major institutions of society. The academy, the media, the business establishment, the medical establishment, mainline churches to their shame, and our civil government. So I say that ideas have consequences. You've probably heard that phrase before. Ideas have consequences, but more than that, bad ideas have victims. Right? Kelsey is a victim of a bad idea. So I want to talk about this morning, in the time that we have left, a few things. Some key ideas to better understand how did we get to this cultural moment that we're in today here in Canada. So I'm going to talk about the concept of the social imaginary, a helpful idea for me anyway, so hopefully it'll be helpful for you once I explain it. This idea of the authentic self and the psychological self and the rise of this concept, the concept of expressive individualism versus external authority. Then we're going to go through a very brief sketch of some philosophical ideas that have led to where we are today, a brief sketch of psychological ideas that have led to where we are today, and then ending with a brief reflection on how does the church, in today's cultural moment here in Canada, how does the church respond? Okay, so if today you feel like, and if you're anything like me, this is the way you feel. If you feel like when you talk about this idea of identity or sexuality or sexual ethics with somebody who is not a fellow Christian, that oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes when you engage in that conversation with a neighbor or colleague, you feel like it's totally fruitless, like your ship's passing in the night, that you're not connecting, that whatever you say just doesn't seem to click. And that is because there are certain assumptions that are alive in our culture today, in our society today, that make it that way, make it very difficult for us to be able to actually understand that the words that are coming out of my mouth mean something of consequence, and that they should accept the things that I'm saying as true and having consequence, having implications. And yet we seem to be like ships of the night passing, and we're not clicking, we're not connecting at all. I'll give you one example where it's not quite on point, but I think it gets the point across. Going back already 14 or 15 years ago, I think it was my last year of law school. And it was Easter Monday or Tuesday. It was right after Easter. And I was with a group of fellow law students, and we were talking. And one woman in that group of law students started telling the group about her sexual encounter that weekend. I don't know exactly what the details were, but she was talking about her sexual encounter over the course of the weekend. And so as she was telling her story, I turned away from the group, and I was going to walk off, but I saw another colleague coming towards me. And I had talked with him earlier the previous week about, he had said, he had grown up Christian, but he wasn't really interested in church anymore. And I said, well, look, Easter's coming up. Why not go to church on Easter Sunday? If you haven't been for a while, you should try. And he said, okay, I'll think about it. Anyway, so I saw him coming towards me, so I called out to him and said, hey, Chris, did you go to church yesterday? I think it was a Monday, it was Tuesday. So I said, did you go to church yesterday for Easter? And the young woman that was telling everybody about her sexual encounter that weekend stopped mid-sentence, turned to me with this look of shock on her face, and she said, Andre, you can't ask him that. That's private. So that's despite the fact that we call a worship service here on a Sunday, we call it a public worship service, right? It's public. It's for anyone who wants to come can come. It's a public worship service. So intuitively, like in her mind, there was something that told her that religion is this deeply private, deeply personal, deeply individual thing, that it's not for us to at all pry into that, but that apparently sex is a very public thing. In fact, it's something that you should flaunt and tell others about with extreme detail. And I use that story just to try to highlight that difference between where she was at and where I was at, because I really did not know what to say in the moment. I mean, with me, this happens all the time. I've got great rejoinders about 24 hours after the fact. It happens every time. But in the moment, it's like, I really don't know what to say. Anyway, intuitively, she was at a totally different level than where I was at. And so there's a helpful philosopher. He's one of the leading philosophers in the world today, living still, and his name is Charles Taylor, pictured on the top left. And he has written a profound work of philosophy called The Secular Age. And in that book, he talks about this concept known as the social imaginary. And when I read about the social imaginary, things started to click for me a little bit better. So I'm going to quote from his book what he means by this. Okay, we think the way we do based on intuition that's unconsciously absorbed from the culture around us. And this is what he's talking about a social imaginary. He says, I want to speak of social imaginary here rather than social theory, because there's important differences between a social theory and social imaginary. I speak of imaginary because I'm talking about the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings. And this is often not expressed in theoretical terms. Rather, it's carried in images or stories or legends, right? It's the stuff you would absorb through, watching a movie or reading a popular book today, that sort of thing. Okay? But it's also the case, he says, that theory is often the possession of a small minority, whereas what is interesting in the social imaginary is that it is shared by large groups of people, if not the whole society. Okay, so a social theory, a bunch of academics sitting in their ivory tower at a university, they might have a social theory. Marx had a social theory. Darwin had a social theory. But here he's talking about, the social imaginary. What's everybody commonly thinking? And then the third difference between a social imaginary and the social theory is that the social imaginary is the common understanding which makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. And so, excellent book, by the way. I do get a commission, so buy these and tell them that I sent you to the book table. Carl Trueman explains the social imaginary, and he applies it in this book, Strange New World, and even more so in his the prequel to Strange New World, the book before that book, which is called Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is also fantastic. He says that that's how we can explain how today a man can say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, and the majority of Canadians are like, Whereas if just 10 years ago, if a man said, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, most people would say, well, what's going on? That can't possibly be. It's because the social imaginary is that vast majority of Canadians today have just accepted this now as true. And so what this does for me anyway, and maybe it's helpful for you, is that when you understand the social imaginary as being more like the water we swim in or the air we breathe or whatever other metaphor you want to use, it's not a coherent, carefully crafted worldview like a biblical worldview. Rather, the social imaginary, it allows for many or maybe even most Canadians to accept that Kelsey was in fact a boy trapped in a girl's body, and that it's actually a good thing to inject her with these opposite-sex hormones, these synthetic hormones, and that it's a good thing to surgically remove her healthy breast tissue, and to not question it, to not ask any questions. That's the social imaginary that would lead to that. And I find that it's helpful because it explains why so many well-meaning people in Canada seem so intent on pursuing these destructive things and then be so blind to it. Okay? The social imaginary is like the spirit of the age, so overwhelmingly all-encompassing that unless by the grace of God you have your eyes open to see its destruction, you too would believe it. So let's talk a little bit about culture and core identity. Okay, what is culture? Well, you'll have probably 1,000 definitions of culture out there. If you wanted to just narrow it down to a Christian view of culture, it's about 980 definitions of what culture is from a Christian perspective. There's a ton of different opinions on what exactly is culture. Ventil, the philosopher Ventil, he said that culture is religion externalized. Religion externalized. So to put that another way, culture is the public display of a group's religious assumptions. But the point that I want to hone in on here this morning is that culture precedes the individual. Okay? It's greater than the individual. Culture is prior to the individual, and culture is formative of the individual. And what culture does is it directs me as an individual outward, right? Culture gets me to engage in work, in worship, in neighborhood, in family. It's outward directed. But at the beginning of the 20th century, due to ideas that were already being kicked around earlier, and I'm going to get to some of those ideas, there's this dramatic turn inward. Right? So instead of me as an individual in culture being directed outward, thinking about my family or my church community, my neighborhood, my nation, my work environment, my employer, instead, at the beginning of the 20th century, said, no, for me to know who I am, I need to look inward. I need to look internally. And this explodes in a really big way in the 1960s with the sexual revolution. Now, in different epochs of time, the dominant culture said something about what it meant to be essentially human, what the most important aspect of your identity was. And this is explained in Strange New World. And this is where I'm getting it from. So if you go back 2,000 years, 2,500 years, if you go to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the most important aspect of your identity was political. Your political identity in relation to the republic, in relation to the city-state, the polis in ancient Greece. That was your core identity. That was the thing that mattered most about who you were. You in relation to the political. And then, of course, with the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the church, that shifted. And for about 1,000 years, the key core identity that you had, what it meant to be human, essentially, most importantly, went, and you can hardly see it on the screen, sorry, but it says religious man. It's that man was essentially religious. And your identity was, at its key point, was its relationship to the church, you in relation to the church. And then about maybe 300 years ago or so, that started to shift towards seeing man as economic man, that you in your essential relationship or your essential identity was in relation to your economic interactions with other human beings. That didn't last all that long because already in the early 1900s we have another shift where essentially the most core part of you being a human being, what really identifies you is that you're a psychological being. And even more, not just psychological, but also a sexual being. Okay? And this is telling you, these epochs in time are telling you who you are in your identity at your core. Okay? Your core identity. But then, how does that relate actually to identity and authority and community? So there's not anything particularly wrong about finding an aspect of your identity in politics or in religion or in economics or even in psychology. That's not the problem. It's not that, we need to go back in time and say that man is in their essence a religious person more than anything else. Rather, these are all aspects of what your identity is made up of. But what's interesting to me anyway is that to have your identity, it's always in relationship to other people, particularly to other communities, right? So, political man, your identity is in relation to the nation or the nation state or the city or whatever, the polis. But that's true of me too, because I'd say I am a Canadian. But that's not something that requires me to be in dialogue, in relation with other Canadians for that to have any meaning at all. For me to say I am a Canadian, there has to be non-Canadians that exist for that to make any meaningful sense, and there has to be other Canadians who also identify as Canadians for me to have an identity that's real. It requires recognition, meaningful recognition of that relationship as a Canadian. Okay, the same thing is true of the church. For me to say I am a Christian, that's an identity that I have. I would say it's my primary identity, as we heard from the previous speeches, is that my identity is found in Jesus Christ. But even just to think about it in a smaller way, say, oh, I'm a member of a church, I'm a member of a religious community. Again, for that to make any sense, it can't just be me as a sole individual flying around on my own. It has to be in relationship with other members of that community for it to make any sense, to have any meaning. And the same thing is true also for family. If I say I am the son of Herman and Christina Schutten, which I am, there has to be a Herman and a Christina Schutten to exist for me to have a meaningful relationship with them, and for that to impact who I am, that aspect of my identity, and then to be able to communicate it meaningfully to other people. All of that to say, and this is also true incidentally of your biology, for me to say I am a man, my biology tells me that I'm a man. In order for that to make sense at all, there has to be a category that's recognized by other people as being that of men, biological men. It has to exist, and I'm living in relation to that category. Okay, so for identity to be meaningful, it has to be dialogic. There has to be relationship and back and forth. There has to be recognition. I'll give you a silly example. I have 3 children, a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. I love the 2-3 stage. I love the 2 stage because it's a lot of fun. He's just entered the 3 stage, and it's not terrible 2s, it's terrible 3s, big time with this guy. And but anyway, the moments when we do have a lot of fun is when we do make-believe, right? And so if my 3-year-old comes running up at me and says, "Rawr, I'm a lion," if I stand there stone cold face and just like, "No, you're a 3-year-old biological boy. You're my son and my wife's son, and you're a member of Jesus Christ by faith through the covenant of baptism." And I could do that and say, "No, you're not a lion." But the fun thing is the relational aspect of like, "Oh no, you're a lion." And I run around the living room and he chases me, he's like, "Rawr," and I'm like, "Oh, I'm so scared." Then he's having a lot of fun. I'm recognizing, I'm dialoguing with my 3-year-old to give some meaning to his, yes, make-believe, but his identity as a lion or as a dinosaur or whatever. Well, it's the same thing in culture. In order for me to have any sort of sense of meaning in my identity as a man, as a Christian, as a son of Herman and Christina Schutten, as a Canadian, or any other aspect of my identity, there has to be a recognition from the other side, which leads us to this issue of this turning inward to find your identity solely in yourself and this expressive individualism. Because what it does is that expressive individualism says, I get to be whoever I want to be, and I'm only going to look inside to find that identity. You can't impose any aspect of my identity on me, which is a bit crazy because most of our identity is actually imposed. I didn't choose Canada. I was born by the providence of God in Canada, right? I didn't choose to be Canadian. I was born Canadian. I didn't choose to be a Schutten. I was born into, by the providence of God, born into a family known as the Schuttens. Anyway, but if I say, no, all of that's oppressive, all of that's imposed, so I reject all of those aspects of my identity. Instead, my identity is only what I choose and what I express outward. And now, for that to have any meaning, I have to force you to accept and dialogue with that new identity that I'm projecting, right? And so that puts a ton of pressure on you as the rest of society to accept whatever I am projecting outward. Because if you don't accept whatever I project outward, then I feel like I no longer have any meaning, any sense of identity. Okay? Truman says in his book, he says, the intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary, in light of all of this, he says, it prioritizes victimhood. It sees selfhood in psychological terms. It regards traditional sexual codes as oppressive and life-denying, and it places a premium on the individual's right to define his or her own existence. And then all of those things play into legitimizing and strengthening those groups that can define themselves in such terms. And they capture, one might say, the spirit of the age. Okay, so let's just look at that first that first half of the paragraph from here to here for a second, okay? So he says, the intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary, right? The social imaginary is the way just our whole culture is just accepting as true, without question, reality. Whether that reality is real or not is another question, but anyway, they accept it as true reality. It prioritizes victimhood, selfhood in psychological terms, traditional codes as oppressive, life-denying, and places a premium on the individual's right to define for themselves their own existence, which is all contrary to a Christian worldview, right? We can't accept that. We can't accept that we're primarily a victim. We can't accept that we're primarily psychological people. We cannot accept that a sexual code, as written in the Bible, is oppressive and life-denying. And so because we can't identify that way, because we can't accept that way, then who are the ones that actually get to rise ahead in the spirit of the age? Well, the ones that get to be strengthened by those definitions at the top, they're the ones who rise to the top within society. Okay, that's why you see, for example, members of the LGBTQ plus community. They're a very small minority within the general population, but they have an outsized influence in culture. And it's because they're legitimized and strengthened through these ideas in our social imaginary. Okay? So I'm just going to jump backwards for a quick second. We're going to look at a couple of philosophers' ideas and how that's fed into this development of thought. Okay? So we're going to go back in time. We could go way back in time to the idea of the Greek philosophers and the Stoics and the Gnostics and so on. We're not going to go that far. We're just going to go to 1700s with this guy. Anyone know who this is? Yes, very good. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Excellent. If I had a candy bar or something, I'd toss it your way, but I don't, unfortunately. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Romantics. With Rousseau, he was a radical. He's actually from Geneva, believe it or not, so it comes from the same stomping grounds as John Calvin. Calvin went one direction, and Rousseau, almost in reaction to Calvinism, actually goes in a radically different direction. And he says that the key to understanding human selfhood is by looking at the inner self, right? He talks about the noble savage and things like of that nature. And one of the things he says is that sexual codes, in particular Christian sexual codes, also structures in society, like the structure of the natural family, monogamous marriage, and so on. He says all of that is oppressive. The opening line, I think, of his book, The Social Contract, said, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains, something like that. And that's what he's talking about. The chains are the existence of the church with its codes, its moral codes. It's the existence of institutions like the family and its oppression of monogamous marriage, despite everything that Reverend Mordike had to say this morning. He sees it, Rousseau sees it, only as this oppressive institution. Man is everywhere in chains. He says that human nature is itself a construct designed to reinforce and perpetuate this subjugation. And so Rousseau and a whole bunch of philosophers after him, they try to throw off those chains, what he sees as chains. He tries to throw them all off. And these philosophers, they end up dealing, as Truman describes in his book, they deal lethal blows philosophically and scientifically to the ideas that nature has any intrinsic meaning and that human beings have special significance or an essence that determines how they should behave. Okay, so the world's teleology, its direction, is destroyed by a number of these philosophers. I'm going to look at three more philosophers. And what they're doing is these philosophers are totally undermining the metaphysical foundation for human identity and morality. That is, undermining completely the answer to the question, who am I and how should I live? Who am I and how should I live? The Christian worldview, the Word of God, answers that question for us firmly, soundly, wonderfully. And these philosophers destroy that foundation. So the first one that I want to, or the second one, I guess, that I want to talk about is Marx, very briefly. Karl Marx, his philosophy was focused on economics, right? So he's writing in this period of time, this epoch where we see the rise of man as an economic person in his essence. And Marx is writing in that time. But he sees Christianity and the structures of society. He too sees these as a man-made invention meant to oppress people, to keep them subjugated. And so he's the one who famously said that religion is the opiate of the people. That religion is not true. Rather, it's a tool of the powerful to keep the weak masses under control. So he destroys the foundation that the God who is there, the God of history, reveals himself in his word as the Redeemer King. And the word of God then, for him, he says we have to treat it with utmost suspicion, if not scorn. He's trying to rip that foundation out from under all of society. Be very suspicious of Christianity. He says it's just a man-made religion to keep you under their heel. And writing at the same time, so if Marx is writing in philosophical economic terms, Darwin is writing at the same time in philosophical scientific terms. And Darwin has this radical materialism, that really all that there is in life is the material. It's the things you can touch. It's stuff. That he's very dismissive of the spiritual realm. And therefore he removes any reference to God or the spiritual world. With Darwin, he convinces the world, for the most part, that the world has no designer, that there's no creator, and therefore if there's no creator, there's no purpose. We are the product of matter, time, and chance. So there's no design. And if there's no design, there's no telos, there's no purpose. We can make of life what we want. We're just these products of these accidental products. As a friend of mine liked to say, we went from the goo through the zoo to you, and that's what Darwin stands for. And after Darwin, we have Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a philosopher from Germany, and he had an even more nihilistic view of things. He says that morality is not anything objective in any sort of way. Rather, it's a matter of taste and it's a matter of manipulative power games. God is dead and we have killed him, he says. In some ways, he's actually the opposite of Marx. So Marx was all about the collective. Nietzsche was all about the individual. So in some ways, they seem to be opposites. And yet, they also share this common hatred or derision of Christianity. Nietzsche, in particular, argued that each man must be his own God, the maker of his own destiny. And so all of their philosophies are actually well embedded in the Western canon now, like to the point where some of their thought is actually subconsciously accepted, even by Christians in the West today. And it informs how we get to where we are today when their ideas are built on top of or meshed in with psychology. So the next philosopher who mixes his philosophy with psychology is of course, Sigmund Freud. So Freud's idea was, he says, well, man in his essence, he's not a political animal, he's not a religious person, he's not an economic person. He is a sexual being. At his core, every human being is primarily, first and foremost, a sexual creature. In fact, he says we're sexual from infancy on. And he says our sexual desires, they're decisive and for who we are. But Freud doesn't go to total sexual anarchy, though. He says, look, so these moral codes that we have in place, you kind of have to have them. Like they're a necessary evil was almost the way Freud would have seen it. He said we have to, in order to avoid total anarchy in society where sexual beings just do whatever they want sexually, that's obviously going to lead to discord and victims and so on. He says we have to contain those sexual drives, and we have to do that through these moral restrictive codes. And, Freud would say, and there's a side benefit to that, because when we repress our sexuality, it forces creative other things to blossom. The arts, wonderful architecture, music, painting, and so on. Creative thinking, collaborative efforts. That all comes out because we've repressed our sexuality and we can't just act on our sexual urges. It forces us to be creative in other ways. That was his idea. But with Freud, he doesn't have the last word because he had a couple of people writing just after his heyday. And that was two guys, Marcuse and Reich, or Reich. I'm pretty sure you pronounce it Reich, but anyway, Herbert and Willem. And what they do is they mix Freud with Marx. So they agree with Freud that, yes, at our core, we are sexual beings. That's our number one identity. But they say those moral codes that repress are really bad. So they reject Freud on that second point, and they embrace Marx. Because Marx said all of these moral codes, they're all oppressive tools to keep powerful people in power and to keep people without power. And so they blend Marx with Freud, and they argue that we need to throw off all of the moral codes of marriage and monogamy. That's oppressive. Throw it off. Throw off the moral codes of the church. That's oppressive. More than that, it's not only oppressive. They would argue that the moral codes around marriage and sexuality and identity, they're harmful and they're damaging. They're doing real harm to people. And we're going to see some examples of their thinking in my next lecture, and in that our own courts, our judges, our legislators are actually embedding this kind of thinking in the way they write their laws. So instead, what they say, you need to be able to do whatever your heart desires. Express yourself however you want, and all of society must accept you and also celebrate you. And so it leads today to things like this, the gender unicorn. The gender unicorn is this teaching tool that's used for elementary school age children. And it says that your real you, your identity, you have to figure out for yourself by looking within. We can't tell you who you are. Your parents can't tell you who you are. We certainly can't tell you whether you're a boy or a girl. We can't tell you what your sexual orientation is, or your gender expression is, or your gender identity is. We can't even tell you what your sex assigned at birth is. We can't tell you who you should be emotionally attached to. We can't tell you who you should be physically attracted to. And so what a child is given is they're given this tool, and they say, this is you. The tool used to be a gingerbread man, and they called it the genderbread man. But the problem was that the gingerbread is a man, and that was not very inclusive. So they switched it to a much more inclusive purple unicorn. And so this teaching tool says that a child, 6 years old, 7 years old, should pick this thing up, and they got to first figure out, okay, what's your gender identity? Do you identify as female or woman or girl or male or man or boy or other gender? And you can slide these three indicators anywhere on the spectrum. You get a pick where you put that. So you might be, 65% girl, 25% boy, and whatever the difference is, another gender. Same thing. So that's your gender identity, and see there's a little rainbow there. So that's the way you think about your own sexual identity, your gender identity. But then there's also your gender expression. That's the way you express your gender to the world around you, right? So you might be 95% feminine and 5% masculine, or 50%, 50%, or 25%, 25%, and 50%, whatever. You slide those things wherever you want, and that's, it corresponds to this green dotted line. It's the way you express your gender to the world around you. And then, of course, there's your actual sex. So when you're born, you're female, or you're male, or you're intersex. Notice the word play here, very, very tricky. Your sex is actually not assigned at birth, right? I mean, that's a word play. It's your sex is actually recognized at birth. You're born with certain chromosomes that tell you whether or not you're female or male. But anyway, so that's a little trick there. And then we're still not even done yet. There's your physical attractions as a 6-year-old. Are you physically attracted to men or women or other genders? And then your emotional attractions as a 7 or 8 or 9-year-old. You're supposed to figure out who you're emotionally connected to, women or men or other genders. And you slide all of those sliding scales around, and that's who you are. You got to look inside to figure out who you are. And I don't know about you, but that confuses me as a 39-year-old lawyer. I'm sure that it must be very confusing to a 6-year-old non-lawyer. But also then, and I don't share this to fearmonger, but to just show you where we are in our social imaginary. How many of you have heard of Blue's Clues? Okay, are you worried about what I'm going to play next? Because I'm going to play something for you next. Okay, so Blue's Clues is a little kids show, I'm guessing age 3, 4, 5, something like that, and nodding heads, 3, 4, 5 maybe. Okay, here's an episode from Blue's Clues. Blue is a blue dog, and he interacts with kids on his little TV show, okay? This is what Blue's Clues ran, a 10-minute episode, I think just last year.
Look at all these families! Hi, families! It's time for a pride parade. Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. This This family has two mommies. They love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade. Families marching 2 by 2, hurrah.
I can put it back on. It goes all the way up to 10, but one is probably enough. So it goes through 10 different types of families, and we're going to look at that again in my next lecture, is the total redefinition of the family. But it goes through 10 different styles of families, blended families, all kinds of families that express their identities along the lines of this gender unicorn. Because the possibilities here, of course, are infinite, right? With those sliding scales. Okay, let me end then with my last minute. I'm going to skip this part because I actually touch on it again in my workshop. I want to come back to Kelsey. Kelsey's story does not end with her expressing extreme regret over her double mastectomy. And it actually ends in 21 when she said, I was going down that hall, I was having these doubts that this is maybe not what's best for me. Is this really what I want? At the same time, when she was 21 years old, she began to detransition. She realized that this transition to trying to make her body look like a male body was actually doing profound harm to her. And so she's now detransitioning. She's reasserting her femininity, her womanhood, her sense of being a woman, and she's projecting that again. She's embracing that again. I don't know, actually, if Kelsey is a Christian or not, but I'm thankful that she is embracing her God-given identity as a woman who has been mutilated tragically, but still, yes, a woman. And I'm going to touch on a Christian story in my breakout session as well about a woman I have met who has a similar story. And so to the children that are out there and to the women and men and boys and girls that you know, they are probably in this cultural moment, because of things like the gender unicorn and the social imaginary that has captured our culture, they're asking 3 really important questions. Who am I? And this was what Kelsey was asking these questions too. Who am I? Where do I belong? And does anyone like me? Who am I? Where do I belong? And does anyone like me? And the church has a profound, beautiful, compelling answer to those deep, deep existential questions. We say that you are unique. So on this point about expressive individualism, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's aspects of expressive individualism that are okay. Why? Because God makes every single one of you, yes, all of you are image bearers of God, but each of you are completely unique. There's no single person anywhere in all of history of the billions of people that God has created, and there's never, ever been anyone who's the same as another person. We're all completely unique, so we can embrace that. We shouldn't be afraid of that. And yet God also creates us as either male or female, so we can also embrace that, right? Diversity and category. That's okay. So you are unique, you're wonderful, you're beautiful as God has created you. Second, you belong. You belong in 2 ways at least. One is you actually belong here within the Christian community. We want to love you, walk alongside you, be a support to you, and encourage you. You belong here. And you also belong, put your faith and hope in Jesus Christ, because he so loved you and the world that he was willing to sacrifice his life on the cross for you. He wants to purchase you with his blood. It's so precious. You belong to him in body and in soul. And third, you are loved. You are loved by that faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, in a way that we can only scratch the surface of, but that we will appreciate more and more every day of eternity. But then you're also loved here. Love within the Christian community or within your family is not going to always mean we affirm every single thing that you think about yourself. But that love is going to be a walking alongside, a holding of the hand, an encouragement to be who God created you to be. And I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Very much, Andre. It says break on your program. Notice it doesn't say refreshment break. This is just more like a stretch break if you need it. I'm going to ask Mr. James Vanderbrink to come up and play for us. Followed immediately by, we're going to show a short video